Not so very long ago, the railroad was the main form of transportation throughout much of the world. Britain was crisscrossed by rail lines that connected villages and hamlets throughout the nation. The British railway system was a source of great national pride. Today, Britain still has excellent rail transportation, but with automobiles, buses, trucks, and airplanes, the railroads are only a pale shadow of what they once were. Throughout Britain, there are stations, signal boxes, and crossings, some now abandoned, which are reputed to be haunted. In fact, next to old houses, the railroads have more reports of ghosts than any other place. Probably the most horrific specter ever encountered on the railroad is the one that was seen during the 1940s at a place called the Broke End Signal Box. A signal box is a place, usually a small building, where the machinery that controls switching trains from one track to another is located. Today, most switching is computer controlled, but not very long ago it was all done by hand, and it was a very important job. The best known appearance of this particular ghost took place at dawn of one spring morning shortly after the end of World War II. A heavily loaded freight train, pulled by an old-fashioned steam locomotive, began slowing down as it approached the signal box. The signalman knew that something was wrong, and he switched the train from the main line to a side track in order to allow a passenger train to pass without delay or danger. As the freight train pulled slowly to a halt near the signal box, the firemen told the signalman that the firebox had to be cleared before they could continue. The firemen also told the signalman about how long it would take to clean the firebox and raise sufficient steam for him to take the train forward. The train guard, a man by the name of George Marsh, was drinking his tea and looking out the window of the stalled freight train. He looked up the line toward the signal box. Suddenly, he saw a white figure crossing the main line toward the broken signal box. The figure was that of a young woman in a white dress. And Marsh knew she was taking a risk because the passenger train was nearly due. In fact, it already could be heard. Marsh got out of the train and ran down the line shouting a warning. The girl seemed to stumble and fall, but as Marsh got nearer, she rose to her feet and staggered toward the steps of the signal box. When Marsh got a close look, he stopped and was overcome by an unimaginable feeling of horror. The girl in the white dress no longer had a head, and there were bloodstains all over the front of her dress. This terrifying apparition disappeared as it reached the foot of the signal box steps. Marsh began screaming, and the men who were in the signal box looked out and were able to catch a momentary glimpse of the figure seconds before it disappeared. Marsh was found sitting on the ground sobbing and shaking uncontrollably. The whole incident was reported to the train control, and a doctor was sent. Marsh was in no shape to continue his duties that day or for several weeks to come. The headless figure had been reported by others at the same spot, but most of them refused to talk about it any further. The ghost was traced back to a horrible accident that had occurred some 40 years before in the early 1900s. At that time, a railway worker named Gorman, his wife, and his only child, a daughter named Marion, lived near the signal box in a house provided by the railway company. In those days, the area, aside from the trains, was completely rural, and the Gormans had few neighbors. Marion was a beautiful girl, but since she had very little contact with others her own age, she was very unsophisticated. She spent a lot of her time taking long walks in the countryside with the family dog. She seemed quite content with a simple and lonely existence. All of that changed when Ronald Travis began working at the signal box. Ronald was in his late 20s and had learned the complicated job of signalman very well. He didn't seem to mind the night work or the tedium of the long and lonely hours. He was dependable and cheerful and much liked by his fellow workmen. Marion and Ronald were immediately attracted to one another. They began spending all their spare time together. At first, the Gorman family encouraged the relationship. They were delighted that their only child had found such a solid and trustworthy young man. But then the relationship began to progress far more rapidly than the Gormans wished. Marion began to disappear for long periods of times and then return home without saying where she had been. Ronald would not give any explanation when asked about her whereabouts and seemed to resent any questions from the girl's parents. Matters came to a head one chilly evening in November. Gorman remembered that he had to give Ronald a message about a change in the next week's work hours. So he walked over to the signal box and found the couple together. Though this should really not have surprised Gorman, he had managed to blind himself to what was going on. Now, he could no longer deny the obvious, and he felt shocked and betrayed. He lost his temper and accused Ronald Travis of luring away his daughter. The couple protested that they were deeply in love and wished to be married, but Gorman was so enraged that he forbade Marion to see Ronald ever again, and then practically dragged her home. Now, Marion's family kept her under almost constant watch. She was not allowed to go out alone. There was endless bickering in what was, not so very long ago, a tranquil and very happy house. One night, after a particularly violent argument, Marion ran up to her room and locked the door. Her parents decided to let her calm down and not disturb her. Marion lay in her bed sobbing and thinking of Ronald Travis. She felt that she could not endure her virtual imprisonment any longer. She remembered that Ronald would be on duty soon. She decided that she would wait until her parents went to bed and then slip outside and go to the signal box to see her lover. When she was sure her parents were asleep, she got out of bed, put on her long white dress, and stole quietly downstairs. Marion made her way down the path and across the meadow to the railway line. It was so dark and she could barely see where she was going. And she was so emotionally overwrought that she wasn't really paying attention to what was happening around her. Marion reached the railway fence, climbed over, and started across the tracks. In the distance, she could hear a train coming, but she could also see the yellow lights of the oil lamps on the signal box. If she ran, she could beat the train easily and would soon be with her lover. But as she started across the tracks, she tripped and fell. With the train bearing down on her, she didn't stand a chance. The engine driver saw the body fall practically in front of the train. He applied the brakes immediately, but there was no way of stopping the fast-moving train in time. He and his firemen felt the slight yet terrifying impact. When the train finally stopped and they rushed back to see what had happened, they found that the wheels had passed over Marion and severed her head from her body. By this time, Ronald Travis was also at the scene of the accident. It fell to him to go to the Gormans' house and tell them what had happened to their daughter. There was an inquest, of course. The verdict was accidental death. Gorman retired from the railway and he and his wife moved away. They were never heard from again. Ronald Travis was transferred to another area. While an accident this gruesome could not really be forgotten, it did recede in memory. There were no apparitions or other strange occurrences at the signal box until the 1940s. No one has ever been able to come up with an explanation as to why the ghost suddenly appeared after so many years, nor why after a few years she seems to disappear forever. By the 1960s, the Brook End signal box had been abandoned, but at the last report the structure is still there. The windows have been broken, the inside completely vandalized. It too seems destined to vanish as completely as the ghost of the young girl who died there, trying to reach her lover.